Steven, nice to have you on this recording. Steven, you are a very talented cloud and network security specialist. So if you allow me, we're going to try to dive a little bit in these two topics, cloud security and also network security. And obviously, for many people, it's moving to the cloud. Yeah, that's still, even though it's not exclusively the only activity going on, but it is still very much the view people have or what people do. Yeah, so they would talk about cloud migration. We know today there's more to it. You must have assisted quite some people in this cloud migration. Can you tell us a little bit more about how this is broken down, what you have to do, and so on, and also, if there's, what are the do's and don't do's, and what is a better way to do it versus sometimes more simple ways. So please tell us how can I go about organizing my cloud migration?
I think the first important aspect is to know why you want to move to the cloud. I've seen a lot of companies moving to the cloud for a cost aspect, which is understandable. Other ones is because of it's the easiness of the cloud, and it depending on why they want to move to the cloud, it's important to make the correct plan for their migration. You have people who just want to kind of outsource, like they outsource people, all their infrastructure to the cloud, and then they're gonna use SaaS applications. Look at Office 365, for example. Or you have the ones which are just developers and they don't want to take care about anything beneath the application itself, so they go for PaaS solutions. Or we have the companies who just want to have their data center virtualized somewhere. It's all a different kind of intake to start planning for migration. So it's a little bit depending on where they want to go. I have to say most of the time it's a mix of the three of them. And yeah, you have in the migrations, if they go for SaaS, I have to say it's quite easy. From a security aspect, if you see for what you're responsible, still then in the SaaS, it's for the identity management and the data you put inside. So I should say that are the most important ones, even if you look at the other ones, it always starts with EIM and data security. On the last infrastructure as a service, so moving the full data center, lift and shift. It's the easiest one, I think, to accomplish, but if that's the best one, I doubt. I think we advise also to rebuild some stuff to make it cloud native and to use the cloud at full capacity.
I think many in the early days, there was if I lift and shift, I'm in the cloud and I'm happy to be in the cloud and I'm already going to benefit from some cost savings and so on. And then later on, as this has happened for a while, I think people have changed their views and they realize that, okay, I only take partial benefit of the, as you said, of the cloud, but not full benefit. And even if I don't sometimes simplify my app or think about it clearly, I may not even get the full benefit, even with a lift and shift and so on, and certainly not in terms of the power of the cloud if I don't move to the native version of it. So is that also your view?
That's correct, and what I most of the time view is that in a physical data center, the budget for the company was kind of different than what they have for cloud. So when you talk about cost reduction, that's correct if you keep just the same. but most of the time the IT teams see that they have a lot of other possibilities in the cloud, which is no more limited by physical hardware. So, for example, where it was before limited because they have to buy a server, hardware server, and they only can have one server, now it's very easy to spin up multiple servers. Just a click on a button, which makes that sometimes the costs go very high. Security-wise, if you see where we protected one server before, which was isolated in a physical data center. Now suddenly we have maybe 4 or 5 servers to protect, which have different kind of operating. We are moving the global network security, which is existing in a physical data center, and the networking, the firewalls, we are all moving it to the host now. So there's more concentration host-based than before. So it's also a shift in mentality, in the way of thinking, how to protect your assets.
But do you see many companies already going native today, or how would you describe what you would typically see in 2023?
If we say native, yeah, some companies, yes. Before we saw a lot of everything running on virtual servers. Now we see already more and more, and it's quite huge. It's the containerization, so Kubernetes, Docker, all that stuff. And we also see that certain companies now start looking how can we go for serverless.
Okay.
Which, of course, if you look at the security from the different parts, that's quite different. How we protect a virtual instance compared to how we protect all those spots in a Kubernetes cluster to something which is serverless. Your access to certain portions are reduced. So if you look at the serverless, we can just upload the code, and so we have to do the protection inside the code, or maybe some kind of virtual layer around it. But you no longer have access to anything on operating system level and so on. So it's a totally different way of protecting your assets or your software.
When you have someone, I mean, so obviously we have different ways to go to the cloud, or we have different phases of being in the cloud and then moving more native step by step. Typically, where you as the cloud security specialist and consultant, where do you intervene? In the lift and shift, what do you do when the customer is trying to move more native? What are typically the areas where you help the customer with your special know-how?
Most of the time on the lift and shift part, because it doesn't mean because it was secured on-prem that it's also still secured in the cloud. Yeah, we see that a lot. All kind of tools to just migrate a server, a virtual one or a hardware one on a physical data center to the cloud. And then most people think now it's just moved, so everything is still in place, which is not the case on that part. And then I think if it's lift and shift or even native, a lot has to do now with EIM permissions. Quite easy to start in the cloud, and you give everybody full admin permissions, and your applications or your server is allowed to do everything. That's where most companies start, but then reducing everything to the least privilege, that's a hard one. You have to understand how the different services are interacting, who needs which permissions. So that's one of the advisory roles on getting close to the least privilege model for all cloud services.
Maybe one comment there. What I've seen is, there is already new know-how to be acquired in terms of migration to the cloud, or what is needed in the cloud, depending on what phase you are. But thanks for bringing up the identity and access management part. It was a privileged access management part. Of course, everybody has heard about it, or many people, some people use it, but the know-how is not so widespread yet on the best practices on that side. So, do you advise people also on how to actually implement privileged access management, or PAM, in the cloud? Or I guess that's sometimes very new in general, and specifically for the cloud. How? Because
No, we advise on that one. And for example, you hear everybody talking about defense in depth, and we see a lot of companies for the moment who try to solve everything with encryption. But if you don't put the correct privilege or rights on your encryption keys, and you just give everybody or every service access to them, they can use the keys. So it makes no sense even to encrypt because everybody can use the keys.
oh, absolutely.
So we see that a lot. We just put all kind of encryptions, and then you get long discussions about which method is best and if you can rotate the keys or not. But in reality, they forget the permissions on the keys.
Some people, I mean, it's, if you look at the next level, the key word is always zero trust. Yeah. It's a bit difficult to sometimes capture what it is. Do you see people or using it in real life, or at a certain scale, or is that still a very rare?
Everybody talks about it. I think if you compare all the vendors, they have a different definition of it. Yeah, I see in the field a lot of companies trying to implement a little bit of it, but for a full picture, I don't think it's already ready for it. So you have to make too much. They have already certain tools they have, and you have to do an integration with all those to have all the data to really be able to implement a full zero trust model. So it's difficult part. I see.
Just moving on a bit in the discussion. We talked about the migration and the phases in a bit. Any thought about how to organize this project team who is going to accompany this move to the cloud? What have you seen, and what do you think is better? And again, where do you intervene?
I think you need all the teams which are involved in the normal IT part. So the operational team has to be there from the beginning. The architecture team for sure, but also data and governance is an important one. And the SOC, I see a lot of also people moving to the cloud without taking into consideration that the log stream and so on will now be different, not on the part for server logs and so on, but for example for all the API calls to the cloud. So the SOC has to be integrated, that they are aware and that they can also look forward to build use cases for specific cloud parts.
Okay. So do you see, I mean, obviously typically companies may have on-prem, the SOC on-prem, obviously is now the SOC partially moving to the cloud itself to be closer to the data and to avoid this kind of uploading, downloading, or which can be slow, which can be difficult, or can cost money.
I see SOCs which have their infrastructure in the cloud. And for other companies, it's important to have everything still on site. So to offload all the data from the cloud, security related log files and so on. That's a preference by company.
Okay. Depending on their needs and their preferences, you'll advise in one way or another, I assume.
Yeah, you have to take also the legal part in consideration all the time. The regional laws, for example, GDPR, or that's an important one for multinationals, as would say. You can easily change the region in a cloud configuration. that the data is staying where it should be and it's not moving around in a global fashion.
Now, looking at a bit at the timeline, what have you seen typically? How much time does it take to migrate to the cloud? Of course, lift and shift is kind of one-to-one, maybe. Later on, of course, the phases may differ depending on what
It depends. It depends on the assets, the number of assets that have to be moved. And where I see all companies struggling with is moving. It's quite easy. Like I said before, you have all kind of tools to do a lift and shift or even a rebuild. That's still okay. But knowing the connections they need, where is my application talking with, who is talking to my application, that's quite a difficult one. So they had the old data center, and some parts were protected by a firewall, so they have some view inside their connections. But then inside that certain segment or VLAN on their data center, everything was freely communicating. It's quite difficult to find out which communications they need. So I've seen sometimes it can take 6 to 8, 10 months before they have everything on paper documented on the connections.
Okay. I think, when cloud came up and then cloud migrations came up, it seems to me a little bit we lived in a different world, and then came COVID and other things, and suddenly, the word resilience got a special meaning. If you look at the recent migrations and so on, or recent thinking of anybody on the architecture side, do they conceive this cloud migration differently if they factor in the resilience aspect? Because I have seen cases recently where the idea was to simplify first before we move to the cloud. Essentially, not only to make the cloud migration easier, but also to make the resilience easier later. So what is it, what you see, or where would you advise, or where do you come in play?
Yes, so it depends again on the size of the company. But where we saw before a lot of manual work in GUI-like consoles, I see now more and more companies directly starting with infrastructure as code, so that they just can change the code very rapidly to deploy the same resources in another region or in even another cloud provider, I should say, to get that resilience part. I see also more and more of them setting up a kind of a standby site somewhere else, virtual in the cloud, other region or even other part of the world, depending on the business they have, to be able to cope with all kind of things, not only like COVID-19, but also for preparing for certain cyber attacks, for example. One region should be hit on cloud provider level, that they can just move their infrastructure to another one.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Another and most important aspect is obviously we have different options nowadays, and we are a lot smarter. How any thoughts about the financial aspects of moving to the cloud? At the beginning was everything is cheaper. Now we know that sometimes operations is not necessarily cheap. On the other hand, because of resilience, it still has advantages. So the financial, the ROI and the financial logic or the financial aspects may have evolved. Any views on that?
Yeah, I think I saw the last few months, even a little bit longer, we see everywhere FinOps departments starting up to get a grip on the costs for cloud. So what I explained before, now it's very easy to spin up extra resources to get resilience, to get more performance. but that has a cost, and you have to keep the costs low, I should say. You also have all kind of features which are very easy. The cloud is built, of course, which were not calculated when companies were moving to the cloud. So if you compare it one-on-one, okay, it will be probably less expensive, depending on how quickly you can get rid of your physical data center, because otherwise you still keep having that cost. And then people start building native, getting auto scaling, for example. If I get a lot of traffic, I just put 4 machines more, which has a cost, which was not calculated. I want to protect more. I have more protection if I enable a certain service that we didn't have on the physical data center. Okay, we have more protection, but it has a cost. Yeah, it's quite difficult to get a grip on the costs and on what can be done in the cloud. So if IT wants, they can very quickly raise the cost very high. But before, you have to have the money to pay the vendor for the physical hardware before you could have it. So operational wise, where we have before need a lot of people to do all kind of operations, we see now more and more automation kick in. If you look at the vendors, they also go for automation on all kind of their products they are selling. That's just to also limit that cost aspect, of course.
Makes sense. There still seems to be many things to come on that side. So it's maybe
if you look at, if I take for example AWS, and you look at the cost calculator, you can say, it's only 5 cents or something per megabyte. But then suddenly they are running something, and then they end up with a bill of 10,000 or something. They did not calculate. It seems very small, the amount on the price list, but it can quickly add up.
It's scalable.
Yeah, it's scalable.
To the upper side, mostly. Yeah, okay.
I think even that's a special business or a special way of thinking to reduce those costs for cloud. Optimize your cloud posture, optimizing security in the cloud, and then trying to get it for a good cost and reducing the cost of it.
Well, it seems to me that there's I think the IT teams need now, as you kind of hinted, someone in the team who is very focused on the optimizing the cost, because there's so many choices to be done and there's so many pitfalls. It's not trivial anymore, not easy anymore to estimate the cost.
It also requires that there is correct tagging on all resources, so you can see where the costs are exactly coming from. So there's a lot of work behind the scenes to get that correctly on paper.
Well, I think that concludes a bit of our discussion. As you can see, Steven has quite a vast experience, and the topic is getting more complex. And I think that's where, in many ways, you need sometimes help, someone who has gone before you, who can calculate or plan a couple steps ahead of you. Because if you do the right choices today, it will make the move less painful, probably cheaper, and you'll get a better result. So I think this is the planning is all, and I think that's why also QB Consulting offering this kind of service. So please do not hesitate also to get back to Steven or to QB Consulting should you be interested. Obviously every case is different, so it's important that this discussion happens between all parties. And again, Steven, thanks very much for having shared these insights with us. And we'll have a separate video to cover also Steven's work in network security. Even though we moved to the cloud, there's still a bit of work to be done on-premise. So we'll make sure that you have a look at also that part of his services. So thank you, Steven.
Thank you.